For those of you that have come since we had the annual general meeting, I'm Duncan Bowie. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Society. So welcome to the Socialist Society annual face-to-face meeting. I mean, most of our sessions are online. We do about one a month. We actually had one on gender and witchcraft in the 17th century on Tuesday, which some of you no doubt listened to. But we're really pleased to have a face-to-face meeting. You can actually see everybody. Really pleased to have Professor Donald Sassoon here. I mean, probably I was going to say it doesn't need much of an introduction. I mean, he's a well-known historian of comparative European history. He's an emeritus professor of comparative European history at Queen Mary's University of London. He's written a series of very substantive works over the last 30 years or so. 100 Years of Socialism, published in 1996. The Culture of Europeans, published in 2006. Mussolini and the Rise of Fascism in 2008. The Anxious Triumph, A Global History of Capitalism in 2019. And one called Morbid Symptoms, Anatomy of a World in Crisis in 2021. Possibly, I wasn't familiar with another of his publications. He wrote a study on the background to the Mona Lisa, which has been translated into 10 different languages in 2001. And I also discovered in my archive his first publication, I gather based on his PhD, Italian Communists Speak for Themselves, from 1978. So his new book is on Revolutions, A New History. Over to you.
Thank you very much. The earliest chapters in this book is a slightly polemical tone about the impossibility of defining a revolution. A revolution in common usage is an event which overturns the structure, the politics, or the constitution of a particular state. And it is, like most complex phenomena, virtually impossible to define. Theda Skocpol valiantly tried by explaining that social revolutions are, and I quote her, rapid, basic transformation of a society, state, and class structures. Yeah, okay, but changes in class structures can happen without a revolution. Revolutions usually start with the breakdown of a state, finance, law and order, etc. A period of crisis ensues, and then either the state is reorganized in a modified form, or a new state emerges. But fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, were they the results of revolutions, as some of their supporters claim? Both Mussolini and Hitler were appointed according to established rules, and the violence that immediately followed had been legalized by them, of course. Similarly, the fall of communism in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, which did involve the breakdown of existing states, was not called a revolution. Is the central aspect of a revolution the participation of the masses, as much Marxist and non-Marxist scholarship assume? This too is difficult to define. The majority of the Russian masses did not take part in the actual revolutions of 1917, whether that of February, which ended the Romanov dynasty, or that of October, which started the process leading to the victory of the Bolshevik. Eventually the masses joined in, but as part of the ensuing civil war and on various sides. How about the anti-colonial revolutions? Those involved the destruction of a colonial state apparatus and its replacement with a state run either by settlers, as in the revolutions of the Americas, or by indigenous population, as in most of Africa. What about the separation of Greece from the Ottoman Empire, often called the Greek Revolution? There was an uprising in 1821, but success arose only when Great Britain, France, and Russia intervened in 1827. By 1830, Greece had become an independent state. though its first king, Otto of Bavaria, was German, imposed by the British, quite different then from the French and American revolutions, not to speak of the Russian. Then there are cases in which a single state takes over other states, as was the case with the unification of Italy, 1861, and Germany, 1870. And these led to momentous radical changes of regimes, but they were not called revolutions. That Gramsci mentioned the Italian one using the term already used by others, rivoluzione mancata, the failed revolution or mis-revolution, because it did not emancipate the peasantry. Reforms, which is usually its reforms and revolution are the sort of twins in these stories. Reforms have often been justified as a way of preventing revolutions. Many of those who supported the extension of the suffrage in 1832 argued that it was the most effective way to prevent a revolution. As the historian and Whig politician Macaulay explained in his House of Commons speech in favor of a wider suffrage in March 1831, reform that you may preserve. If a change in the economic power structure of society is essential, then the American Revolution was not a revolution. Had not the American Revolution taken place, slavery might have been abolished sooner, since it was abolished in the British Empire in 1833. So if America had remained part of the British Empire, slavery might have been abolished 30 years earlier than the actual abolition of 1865, though probably there would have been an anti-colonial rebellion in the South in favor of slavery and of abandoning the Union. Ending slavery in the United States, unquestionably a major radical change, required a civil war, but hardly anyone has called it a revolution. In real history, matters are never clear. Even Karl Marx, who was supposed to know a thing or two about revolutions, is never precise over the use of a term. He never defined the word or used it consistently, nor did he ever produce a general theory of revolution. He seldom even used the term bourgeois revolution. Contrary to what is commonly believed, Marx did not think inevitable that the transition from capitalism to socialism required a violent revolution. In a speech in Amsterdam in 1872, he thought that in countries such as America and England, quote, the workers can achieve their aims by peaceful means. In Das Kapital, the term is deployed with the lack of precision characteristic of everyday language. We find, of course, the odd reference to the British Glorious Revolution of 1688, which was definitely not a revolution, to the French Revolution, to the Revolution of 1848, but there are many more references to the Agricultural Revolution and the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century, which is not a change of regime, it's a change in the economy. In his landmark comparative study of revolutions, Barrington Moore, I'm talking about the social origins of dictatorship and democracy, Barrington Moore noted that the successful bourgeois revolution, that is, those that lead to capitalism, were the Puritan Revolution, i.e. the British Civil War, the French Revolution, and the American Civil War. But there were also conservative revolutions, those lacking popular participation, such as the German, the unification of Germany under Bismarck, and the Japanese, the 1868 Meiji Restoration. And then there were the Communist Revolution, Russia and China, but such efforts to classify revolutions lead Barrington Moore almost inevitably to stress the differences between them in the starting point, in the process, and in the results. Capitalist and democratic societies are not the same, and nor are communist societies for that matter. Processes may have similarities, but also strong points of divergence. And to establish those that matter is in the end an empirical and not a theoretical matter. There were no peasant revolutions in England and France, but there were peasants. There were no peasants subject to landlords in North America, but there was a revolution. There were few workers in China, but it was the peasants who made the revolution. And one of the many problems in the study of revolution is that though revolutions share many similarities, they're also sharply different, as Arno Meyer noted when comparing the French and Russian revolutions in his book, The Furies. Revolutions do not seem to occur in the most economically advanced countries, but in those keen to catch up. England in the 17th century was less advanced, economically speaking, than the Dutch Republic. France in 1789 was behind England. Russia and China looked to the advanced Western countries. Though the search for modernization does not explain revolutions, there is perhaps an element of catching up. The ambiguity of the term revolution was made evident in the widely quoted response by Zhou Enlai, Prime Minister of China, to Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger during their visits in 1972, when they asked him, "What is your view of the French Revolution?" And Zhou Enlai is supposed to have answered, "It's too early to say." This was taken to represent, in accordance with a Western stereotype, the long-term view of a wise Chinese sage with a continuous history of over 2,000 years. The reality, according to Nixon's interpreter, Chas Freeman, and as Chinese archives have corroborated, is that since the distinction between revolution and revolt is ambiguous in China, Zhou Enlai thought Nixon was talking about the Paris event of 1968, which is only a couple of years before, and so it's perfectly reasonable to say it's too early to say. It was, Freeman, the interpreter, explained years later, a misunderstanding too delicious to correct. In recent times, we have increasingly used the term loosely. We write about the Neolithic Revolution, the technological revolution, the digital revolution, the cultural revolution, as well as the anti-colonial revolution. Today we use a term for a plethora of events. We talked about the sexual revolution, the feminist revolution, the social media revolution, all processes that have changed behavior and mentalities. But we also have used the term revolutionary for rock bands, and rock bands themselves talked of revolution, from the Rolling Stones' Street Fighting Man, which intoned, "Hey, think the time is right for a palace revolution," to the Beatles' more moderate revolution, 1968 also. "You say you want a revolution. Well, you know, we all want to change the world." So goes part of the song. By the turn of the 21st century, the word revolution had become trivialized. A beautifying face cream called the Revolution Pro Miracle Cream will transform, or so the manufacturers claim, your tired and dull complexions in just 4 weeks. Emmanuel Macron, a banal centrist politician, published a book in November 2016 during his first successful electoral campaign for the presidency called Révolution, where he talked about his life, his wife, and the great changes he had in mind, none of which he even attempted to implement. Plenty of other cliches. It was advertised by his British publishers as the visionary memoir of a rising global leader. No vision and no rise followed. On the 14th of July 2020, The Guardian discussed the Nespresso coffee revolution without anyone pointing out the importance of a date. 14th of July, the Nespresso revolution, never mind the French. In Japan, the overthrow of the shogunate, the hereditary military dictatorship established in 1192, and the development of a modernizing Western-leaning political system in 1868 was called the Meiji Restoration, not the Meiji Revolution, because they were changing everything. I mean, even the clothes, the food they ate, and so on. But because the change was so dramatic, they just called it a restoration, which is always safe. We're not changing new things, we're just looking back. Quite rightly, the Japanese historian Hiroshi Watanabe points out that the Meiji Restoration was a revolution, since it changed the political regime, the judicial system, the economy, the education system, even clothes, hairstyle, and manners. But there was no mass uprising, not even a limited one. It was an enormous and irreversible transformation, an abrupt historical turning point, but not called a revolution. Thanks to the French Revolution, the term revolution acquired a somewhat positive connotation, at least among progressives, and it spread throughout the 19th century to describe any tumultuous uprising, some successful, many unsuccessful. By the 20th century, the word revolution, long popular in France and the United States, was embraced even by the far right. Mussolini called the March on Rome of 1922 the fascist revolution, though the real changes occurred only a few years later. Joseph Goebbels in 1933 referred to the National Socialist Revolution, while Heinrich Himmler in 1936 denounced the Judeo-Bolshevik revolution of the subhumans, a theme which had been used in various forms by people as diverse as Henry Ford and Winston Churchill. Churchill, who discussed Jewish revolutionaries such as Karl Marx, Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, and others as part of the worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization. Today he would have been expelled from the Labour Party. The Islamic Revolution of 1979, which is called the revolution, was the result of an unstable coalition between liberals and religious leaders, as the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini at first toned down his theocratic outlook and was backed by the Bazari, the commercial classes. Liberal anti-communists too have had their revolutions. For instance, the Hungarian uprising of 1956 and the anti-Soviet turmoil in Czechoslovakia in 1968. But as I mentioned, the end of communism in the Soviet Union and in the satellite countries, the most important regime change in post-1945 Europe have not been called revolutions, except in Czechoslovakia, where the Velvet Revolution of 1989 led not only to the end of communism, but also to the separation between Slovakia and the Czech Republic. There was also the so-called Orange Revolution in Ukraine, challenging the results of presidential elections, and there were other botanically named revolutions, usually demonstrations, such as the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, the demonstration in Maidan Square in Kiev in 2014, which led to the establishment of a government hostile to Russia, was also known as the Maidan Revolution. So the term revolution has remained more firmly entrenched with the left than with the right, though today armed revolutions are more likely to be supported by Islamic fundamentalists than by socialists and communist revolutionaries. we talk very little of the Mexican Revolution, outside of Mexico, of course, and much more of the Cuban Revolution, though the Cuban Revolution did not start as a communist revolution, became communist later. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez called his advent to power the Bolivarian Revolution, though he had been regularly elected in 1998, and all that was changed in 1999 was the Constitution. Similar passage from the Fourth to the Fifth Republic in France was never called the Gaullist Revolution, though it established the presidential system and it was a big change in the French Constitution. The 1952 coup d'etat by army officers under Mohammed Naguib and Gamal Abdel Nasser was sometimes referred to as the Egyptian Revolution of 1952 because of its progressive outlook and because they got rid of the king, King Farouk. And it had been sparked by riots. It is often said that revolutions go bad, that they betray the original high-minded principles when they have them, and that in what has now become a cliché, they devour their children. This expression was coined in 1793 by the journalist Jacques Mallet Dupont and used in an anti-revolutionary pamphlet where he wrote that, à l'exemple de Saturne, la révolution dévore ses enfants. Like Saturn, the revolution eats its children. The use of the guillotine had just begun, which, by the way, was a humanitarian form of execution, since hanging or the axe tended to prolong the agony. In January 1793, the king was executed, King Louis XVI. In the following 18 months, only, quote-unquote, 2,639 people, mainly aristocrats, were guillotined in Paris. It was a terror. Many more died shot or imprisoned, and many more died in the civil war in the Vendée and elsewhere, which originated in peasant opposition to conscription into the French army. So it's far worse what happened outside Paris. Change, however, is vague and controversial. What is certain is that no one can foresee the long-term consequences of change. I realize this is a slogan popular with our beloved leader Keir Starmer, who says, I want change, but of course it doesn't explain what change is. I'm almost longing for a politician to say, vote for me and nothing will change. Take the most famous passage of the Italian novel Il Gattopardo by Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa. It's the most quoted bit of the novel. We are in Sicily in 1860. Garibaldi has just landed with the aim of liberating the south and uniting it with the rest of Italy. Tancredi, the young Tancredi, tells his uncle, the Prince of Salina, that he's about to join the Garibaldini, and the prince is horrified. You're mad, my boy, going with these people. They are troublemakers and mafiosi. The prince is poised between two worlds. He's conscious that he belongs to a noble family whose privileges he enjoys, but he realizes that at this age belongs to the past. So he accepts Tancredi's famous riposte. Uncle, if we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change. This is the great sign of intelligent conservatives. If we want things to stay as they are, then everything must change. Tancredi joins the revolution to stop the revolution, to make sure that nothing changes. Of course, he's wrong. Everything changes. The aristocracy is doomed anyway, and etc. As the leading American abolitionist Wendell Phillips declared, revolutions are not made, they come. But the context of his statement made it clear that one also needed a group of people, quote, pledged to new ideas. In his pamphlet on Louis Bonaparte, Karl Marx struck the middle path between voluntarism and structuralism when he wrote famously, this to me is one of the most important quotes that students of history should bear in mind. You all know it, I'm sure. Men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given, and transmitted from the past. And anyone who wants to study a revolution should bear that in mind. They don't just happen because Lenin is clever, or because Mao is this, or Robespierre, and so on. There are conditions there, and the intelligent leader picks the right moment to do certain things, but is constrained. So what happens depends on a multiplicity of factors, and not just on revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries. Revolutions are usually initiated by a minority taking advantage of an exceptional conjuncture which they had not created. Those who stood against Charles I did not know there would be a republic and a dictator, Cromwell, or the return of the Stuarts after Cromwell. Those who stormed the Bastille could not possibly have known that this would be the first step towards the republic. In fact, frankly, in the Bastille there are only 7 people, so they liberated 7 people. They chopped the head of the governor, and they went on the Bastille not because they wanted revolution, but because they were protesting against the sacking of the reformist Minister of Finance by the king. But it was a spark. So revolutions follow an unpredictable course. As a Russian novelist Mikhail Shorokov wrote in his 1930s masterpiece, And Quiet Flows the Don, and I quote him, "When swept out of its normal channel, life scatters into innumerable streams. It is difficult to foresee which it will take in its treacherous and winding course." Occasionally, reformists need revolutionaries, since the threat of revolution is an excellent instrument with which to warn the reactionaries that if nothing changes, a catastrophe, i.e. a revolution, will ensue. For if reforms are delayed, they make revolution more likely. Bismarck, one of the most intelligent statesmen of the 19th century, knew only too well that occasionally it paid to preempt undesirable change by taking command of changes. Faced with the consequences of the liberal national revolutions of 1848, he declared, "If there is to be a revolution, we would rather make it than suffer it." That's one of the reasons why he starts himself the unification of Germany and later the first welfare reforms in German history. Radical changes have taken place for thousands of years, but the history of revolutions is relatively recent. In the Politics, Aristotle speaks of revolution as something to be avoided, but he does not explain what it is. The word Aristotle uses for revolution is a variant of metabole, which is really about changing course. Today we might talk about regime change. The nearest to a radical shift in power relations occurred in Athens in the 6th century, when Solon introduced his famous reforms that abolished all debts to the advantage of small peasants and at the expense of the nobility. Solon's reforms could be considered a revolution since they shifted power, but they occurred without force and violent civil strife. During the Middle Ages, there were no revolutions, but plenty of agrarian tumults and peasant rebellions, the so-called jacquerie, from a pejorative term used by aristocrats in France to describe the peasants, Jacques Bonhomme, which is a bit like saying Jack Goodfellow. The term was used by Jean Froissart in his famous chronique, 1369 or something like that, And he writes with a disdain mixed with understanding, crushed by taxes, weary of pain and suffering, the people rise up, as they always rise up, without knowing what they are doing or what they want. Absurd, abominable. Jacques Bonhomme goes off like a delirious brute. He pillages, he burns, he kills, and with such fury that the cruelties of men-at-arms are nothing compared to his butcheries. Well, mere revolts are a common feature of history. The German Peasants' War of 1524-25 ended in a massive slaughter of the peasants by the aristocracy, a far greater slaughter than that of the French Revolution. In 1514 in Hungary, the peasant revolt led by György Dózsa was put down, 60,000 of his followers were killed. Dózsa was roasted alive on an iron chair, and his starving comrades forced to eat him. This was never called the Terror, unlike that of the Jacobins. Not all pre-modern revolts have to do with the peasants. The famous Tumulto dei Ciompi, the Ciompi were wool carders, in Florence, 1378 to 1382, could be classified as a proletarian revolt, in which case it would be the first, really. In most European languages, the term revolution was, of course, originally used about natural phenomena described by Copernicus in his On the Revolution of Celestial Spheres. However, in astronomy, a revolution occurs when the body in question returns to its original position, quite unlike states, when revolution is used in the political sense, meaning that the old world disappears for good in favor of a new social order. There is no return to anything. The Romanov don't come back in Russia, the French absolute monarchy does not come back, it's a constitutional monarchy later on, and so on. The term revolution has also been applied to the English Civil War in the first half of the 19th century by the French historian François Guizot, and then in 1889 with the label The Puritan Revolution by the Whig historian, and Christopher Hill declared it a successful bourgeois revolution and a failed anti-bourgeois revolution. The latter was the object of his study. Then until the English Glorious Revolution of 1688, historiography seldom uses the term revolution. Montesquieu, when he uses the term, he means a change of regime. Throughout the Middle Ages, major political changes are referred to as reforms. So we talk of the Gregorian reform of the 11th century after Pope Gregory VII, and not of revolution. We speak of a Lutheran Reformation in 16th century Europe, and not of a Protestant revolution. In classical utopian literature, a revolutionary process is not usually envisaged. In Thomas More's famous Utopia, 1516, and Tommaso Campanella in La Città del Sole, the City of the Sun, 1602, neither Campanella nor More explain how the new state of affairs comes about. They describe a utopia, but they don't tell you how we got there. The revolutionary process is completely absent. The key element of the passage from the past to the future, the actual revolution, is missing. And more recent utopians, such as Edward Bellamy, Looking Backwards, William Morris, News from Nowhere, where the narrators fall in a mysterious sleep and awakes a century later in Utopia. Also, they do not tell us how you get there, how you move from A to Z. The American Revolution was not called a revolution from the outset. Patriots thought of independence. Thomas Paine, though he did use the term revolution, probably because he had been in France and took the bug, as it were, from the French. Subsequently, the word revolution was deployed in many American pamphlets and publications. By 1789, it was widely used by the French revolutionaries as well as by their opponents. They always called it a revolution. The word and the event long caused consternation, and not just in the West. In 1908, the Qing Ministry of Education demanded that all references to the French Revolution in a popular course on world history in Chinese schools should be deleted. I'm amazed actually there are courses on world history because we never had that in schools, not world history. And the Qing Ministry wanted the word revolution replaced with the word chaos. All to no avail. A few years later, a revolution did wipe away the Qing, and nearly 40 years of real chaos ensued. Modern revolutions are often connected to the issue of taxation and finance. The seizure of power, as opposed to rebellions and protests, matters when the state matters, when government is for real, when the state imposes taxes. I disagree with Max Weber, for whom the definition of the modern state is the legitimate use of force. No. It is a legitimate use of taxation. That's what really makes, then with the taxes and all sorts of things. As David Hume explained, governments are, and I quote, one of the finest and most subtle inventions imaginable. For thanks to government and the finances it raises, bridges are built, harbors opened, ramparts raised, canals formed, fleets equipped, and armies disciplined. One occasionally wishes that neoliberals would read a bit of David Hume and learn a thing or two. This is why the history of revolution begins in earnest with the history of the state and the history of a national economy, what we call capitalism, and why revolution should not be seen as sudden, short-lived events which are resolved in a few years. The purported original spark launches a process with new demands and grievances, even when the original ones have been resolved. Revolutions become long-term processes, with, of course, a beginning and an end, however uncertain. One should also avoid the temptation to treat the period preceding a revolution as the period that prepares the revolution. It's a bad habit of historians to always look for the causes of, thinking once you know the causes of, then you resolve the problem. No, you pick on the causes you like, and then you come up with the explanation. The revolution usually arrives unexpectedly, catching the revolutionaries themselves by surprise, even though they spent years or even decades preparing for the great moment. One can of course debate dates endlessly, but there are mere indications of the possible beginning of a process or its conclusion. Assuming anything in history can be really said to be concluded. The famous line by an American commentator, "It's the end of history," was obviously absurd if he really meant that nothing was ever going to happen, and if he really meant only that communism was finished. Well, we all noticed that. I mean, just read the papers. There is no date set for the beginning of the Middle Ages, or their ends, or the beginning of a Renaissance, or the start of capitalism. Processes, almost by definition, do not have clear beginnings, let alone clear ends. And this is why, in my book, I try to strike the middle way between... I take a leaf from the book of Fernand Braudel, who distinguished three kinds of historical times. The longue durée, which is things change slowly and imperceptibly over centuries, like the price of grain, terribly boring. And the other history, the histoire événementielle, which is just like the French Revolution taken 3 or 4 years. And this histoire événementielle, in his view, was the most deceptive of time period. It's domain of journalists, not real historians. My revolution is neither the histoire événementielle, not the longue durée. It's concerned with what he calls Plan B, the middle one, which deals with a longer conjuncture, 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And revolutions, I know I usually remember in terms of a key date because it's useful, but my revolutions, say the English Revolution, starts in 1614 and ends in 1714, because only then the monarchy loses all its powers and becomes purely a symbol, and Parliament has all its power. Until then, there is a dispute. The French Revolution starts not in 89, starts in 88, when the king, who needs money, calls a third estate, and then starts the whole process with the constitutional monarchy, which becomes a dictatorship, Napoleonic dictatorship, return of the monarchy, but a constitutional monarchy, and so on and so on. And only in 1880 it is finally and really and truly a republic, and the monarchists no longer have any powers whatsoever in France. And, we can argue about, the Chinese Revolution, which would begin in 1911 with the end of the Qing dynasty, and then the period of chaos, and then Mao takes over in 49, partly because of the intervention of the Japanese in China, the invasion of the Japanese in China, and on the 1st of October 49, China becomes a communist state, but the revolution continues. There is a cultural revolution. There is a great leap forward. There is a cultural revolution. There are the reforms that Deng Xiaoping, and whatever is China now, well, they like to call it socialism with Chinese characteristics, or let's call it communism with capitalist characteristics, or something like that. But as you can see, it's a very, very, very messy subject, and I'm glad I've tackled it. I certainly have not resolved it, and I'm curious to know what you all think.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm reassured at your comment that the end of communism isn't necessarily the end of history, but we're all still around making and reviewing history, no doubt.